This is the Workplace Podcast with your host, William Corless. Brought to you in association with Yellowwood, your external learning and development partner. Each week, we focus on a different aspect of the workplace. We hear from guest speakers who are subject matter experts and who are incredibly talented at what they do. These experts will give you a different perspective and insight to work life, with the aim of empowering you to take a different path to success in all aspects of work life. These perspectives will include career and personal success, leadership, high-performance teams, and creating a better work-life culture and organisation. Yellowwood, take a different path to success with your career, team, and organisation.
Welcome to the Workplace Podcast. Today's topic is leading your team through change. And joining us today is the author of Forward, Dr. Elizabeth Moran. Dr. Moran is an experienced leader, consultant, and speaker, providing neuroscience-based guidance to successfully navigate change. Partnering with business and HR leaders from Fortune 500 companies to technology startups, she has successfully supported large and small-scale transformational efforts through practical advice and actions that simplify change, leadership, and management. She's the author of the Amazon best-selling book, Forward, Leading Your Team Through Change, designed to make her practical approach accessible to all people leaders globally. Prior to starting Elizabeth Moran Transformation, she was Vice President of Global Leader, Team and Organization Development at ADP. She has held talent development roles at Bloomberg, Lehman Brothers, Getty Images and Time, Inc. She holds a master's and doctorate in clinical psychology from California Institute of Integral Studies, a PCC level certification from the International Coaching Federation, and a certification as a neuro transformational coach. And Dr. Elizabeth Moran is also a self-described change nerd. Elizabeth, Dr. Moran, welcome to the Workplace Podcast.
Thank you, William. Thanks for that lovely intro.
So we have something in common. We are both nerds when it comes to change and aspects of the workplace. And I have to say, such a delight to read this book. And the reason I really enjoyed this book, I have to say to our listeners, this is an essential read. And the reasons are, this is a playbook from beginning to end steps. So, for example, I was reading the book and there's how to conduct different meetings to discuss change. And you have them in 90 minutes, 4-hour sessions, 8-hour sessions, and templates on how to do that. You have practical conversation guides with actually scripts, what to say, especially when you don't know what to say. There's these prompts there all the way through. There's perspective changing questions with leadership wisdom. And I love the Wisdom 2.0 that we'll talk about later on. And I really like, speaking of which, how you interchangeably use change leadership and change management. I really like that. And I have to say, I've read many books on change, and I think this is hands down the best one. So for the listeners, I'm saving you time and money. This is for value. Just buy this book. I guarantee you will thank me. Each chapter, you know exactly what you're buying into. So I'll give you an example. At the very start, it basically says, Chapter 2, our brains and change, and then you bullet list what you're going to cover regards to change management. So, for example, our brains and change, what we'll cover, why people will do almost anything to avoid uncertainty. Then you simply go into neuroscience concepts, threat of uncertainty, negativity bias, switching cost, analytic and empathetic networks, and optimism, and off you go. Now, this is no fluff. It is really interesting and practical. Well done, you.
Thank you so much. Yes, I mean, I have been on the other end of many business books and I loved them. And I've learned a lot from many of them, but I'm like, please, first of all, please use a bullet point, right? Please do not make me read 300 pages and make it practical. So I'm so happy to hear that. Thank you.
Yeah, and what I like is any of the stories that you use are small and relevant. I'm not going to go, okay, get to the point here. You literally get to the point and you pass on all your wisdom and pragmatism, which I like. And I'm going to quote from the book now just to get us started. This is just another decision made by out-of-touch executives who don't understand what it'll mean for the rest of us. So leading change is hard, isn't it?
Very hard. And you know that, right? You've probably heard it yourself. I've heard it as a leader and I've said it as well. I'm like, wait, what do they want to do? And are you kidding me? Yes. So that's just trying to let people know that that's normal.
Yeah. And leading change is hard, isn't it? So I'm going to give examples from the book. Then you're talking about downsizing your department and having to exit people who are really good. A much loved and supportive boss leaves and is replaced by somebody who's not as supportive. You're not sure if they're going to be worse or somebody that you don't like. You're ready to launch a process or a product, and a new sponsor wants to take over and makes changes, upending the work that you've done, or you're trying to implement a change that you think is a bad idea, or your organization is part of a merger or acquisition and affects everything about your job. There's so many different aspects to that, and you cover all of this in the book.
Yes, exactly. And I think the underpinning of all of that is most organizational change happens because somebody in the organization, usually a senior level person, makes a change. And most leaders who are leading through changes are leading through changes that neither they nor their team initiated. And that is key when you want to make a change yourself, right? It's still hard. But when change is not your idea, our brains instantly do something that is very frustrating for most leaders of organizations, but very normal. Hang on. This is what we mean by change as a threat, right? So yes, and most leaders waste a lot of time reacting to the resistance that they encounter. They react to it as if it's a problem. And I understand why. I've been that leader myself. It is frustrating when people don't just do what you tell them to do, right? But again, they're just humans with good working brains.
So this is where you're talking about it's about skillful change leadership, a bit like that phrase you just says, why won't they just do what they ask them to do? And if you're that person listening in, is there a silver bullet to this, or is there something I need to change about my approach? Because you talk about that skillful change leadership aspect.
Yes, I'll give you the silver bullet, but most of the time when I say it, people don't hear it, is that people are like, yeah, but tell me what to do, right? The silver bullet is your perspective. That's everything. As a leader, and that's why the book, it's like start with yourself first. It's okay if you're frustrated. It's okay if you don't buy into this change. You can still lead through a change you're not 100% on board with, right? But the first thing is, what is your perspective? And you talked about the empathetic versus analytic network, and we'll get into that. Rules everything when it comes to your perspective and your awareness is ultimately saying, oh, well, of course somebody would react. The perspective, oh, well, of course my team is going to resist it. They don't know anything about it. It wasn't their idea. Okay, that's normal. I'm going to engage with them there, as opposed to a perspective that says, oh my gosh, there they go again, blah. And then you're already feeling that frustration. You control that. Nobody's making you feel anything. So the silver bullet starts with you and your perspective.
Yeah, and this is what I like about that is you talk about understanding natural brain functions, and neuroscience is really helpful. So certain aspects of neuroscience you go into, like neuroplasticity, threat of uncertainty, negativity bias, switching costs, the analytic and empathetic networks, and optimism. And I might quote, if that's okay, from page 16. Okay. So you quote the work of Dr. Rick Hansen, psychologist and best-selling author. The brain is like Velcro for negative experiences, but Teflon for positive ones. And he goes on to say negativity bias shows up in lots of ways. The result, a brain that is tilted against lasting contentment and fulfillment. What does this mean for a change leader? What does this mean? When you're introducing change to a team, keep in mind that you're introducing an unknown. So your team will automatically start to analyze how the change will be bad for them. The reaction is normal. It means they have healthy working brains and they shouldn't be seen as a team behaving badly. How natural is that?
Well, that's the thing, right? When people initially are like, we have to get something done. I'm in that mode of problem solving, decision making. when I get in, when somebody shows up with frustration or resistance or concern, which is normal, you're in my way of getting things done. So unless you are able at that moment as a leader to be like, oh, right, this is normal, you're going to miss that opportunity. And this is where so much of the neuroscience, when you understand it, it is life-changing, because you realize the ego will look at something that is a change as a threat. That's normal. This is hardwired into us. This is the idea that if something changes in my environment, quite simply, it could kill me. That's what that impulse is. And so you are, as a leader, trying to override, both work with, you'll never get rid of it. So work with that impulse in a positive way that engages it, gives people what they need in that moment to come out of the fear and then begin to move forward. But again, you can see it's very different when you engage it with curiosity and trying to understand, oh, how are you seeing the change? What is it you're reacting to? There might be something very reasonable there. Versus, oh my gosh, right? There they go again, blocking me and not getting things done. Again, it all starts with your own perspective. And then how do you engage that? Because when you can engage it in a way that's healthy, and by healthy, and you do so much wonderful work around conflict, this is it. When you can engage that moment in a healthy way and treating people, that just because it's not my resistance, doesn't mean that their resistance doesn't make sense to them. So how do I understand it? Which just really usually takes a few minutes, right? It asks a question. And that is the instinct the new leader is developing. Instead of just telling somebody what to do and get on with it, it's taking a minute and saying, oh, I'm curious. How are you seeing or understanding the change that is causing you to feel uncomfortable? That's as simple as that. But to make that switch for ourselves to engage that way, from a neuroscience perspective, there's a couple of activities that have to happen in the leader.
And can you tell us more about that switching cost then? And you talk about the analytic and empathetic networks. So you have inertia, we'll say, for example, and it's like, I don't like change. So say, for example, a bank in Ireland was closing down and it had to delay the closing because people were like, well, why do I have to change? And they were like, we're not holding on to your money anymore. They had to keep reminding people, and they delayed it by 3 months because people hadn't done it. Like, inertia is really big, isn't it? And then you have and switching costs is a part of that, isn't it?
Yes, yes. So we can talk about both of those things, because all of these brain concepts, right? It's very hard to isolate them because it's a whole organ. And actually, what's fascinating now is we know actually our heart sends more signals to the brain than the brain sends to the heart. So it's amazing how this is a very intelligent whole system. It's amazing. So anyway, I'm going to start with, if it's okay with you, the empathetic and the analytic network, because I think that's a good grounding for the other. So this was mind-blowing to me and kind of life-changing again when I understood a lot of this. So the analytic network are systems in the brain that work together to help us analyze data, solve problems, keep to timelines, right? It sounds like what it is. Very important when it comes to leading change. The empathetic network is actually the network that enables us, when we're in it, to respond to not only the verbal, but more likely the nonverbal cues. You're more attuned to humans and what's going on with people around you. It also is the place where innovation comes from. So you can think about, it's the ability to pick your head up off of the details and look up and look around. That again alone was mind-blowing to me, because most organizations say, oh, we want innovation, but they favor activities that are analytic network activities, right? That what are the finances, doing all that stuff. And so they reward for those things, which actually can block, right, the innovation process. So as a change leader, when you are encountering an issue, especially an emotional issue, which is resistance, somebody's struggling, you have to make the conscious choice to switch into the empathetic network. If you don't do that, you're simply going to be addressing by trying to give people more information and telling, and it's not going to really probably work very well for you. If there's a miscommunication, or people have the wrong information and they're reacting to that, absolutely, you want to clarify that. But what I deal with more in the book is the emotional side of change, and it's grounded in the neuroscience. So being able to use both, the best change leaders can toggle between those two networks depending on what the situation is. So that's very important. The other piece you're talking about, switch cost, is again another concept that was, of course, that would be going on in my brain. All of us have this, right, unconscious activity going on where we are constantly weighing, is it worth it to us to put in the effort to make this change? Which is why they talk about it's so important to engage people in understanding the why we need to change. Most organizations, when they announce a change, they focus on what the change is and what benefits does the organization or our customers or clients, what we're going to get. The why engages that part of the brain that can begin to help with switch costs. So every time we make a change, there is a cost in terms of effort or time when we have to learn something new. And that is just normal. It happens all the time. But if we don't engage that part of the brain that helps the person understand why it's worth it for them, even if it's tough in the long term, you're never going to make the change. And this is where it gets really tricky for people. To make a change, for instance, maybe you wanted to learn how to play guitar. You had visions of yourself being on that stage, right? Playing that guitar for that audience. And oh my gosh, that sounded good. And you were so excited, very inspirational. And then you actually sat down to learn all the chords and read the music. And all of a sudden it was like, oh my gosh, right? Your brain started to say, no way, this is so much work. That's switch costs. So staying in the inspiration phase feels so much better because there isn't actually a switch cost because there's no behavior change. And this is the irony about it. Doing something differently creates discomfort. Unfortunately, unless you're aware of that discomfort, usually when we have discomfort, our brain says, hang on, there's a problem here. Stop the discomfort, right? But in this case, if there is no discomfort when you're making a change, there's no switch cost, there's no behavior change. So part of your role as a leader is to let people know, yes, when we're learning these things, it's going to feel uncomfortable. The switch cost may be, I'm now having to slow down, and it's taken me a lot more time to complete a task using this new system that they want us to use versus I was able to do it so easily before. There was no switch cost. It was automatic. But you have to get over the switch cost hump. But when you're feeling discomfort, you have to tell your brain, there's no problem here. This is me just learning something new. And this is why for leaders, I talk about how do you overcome switch costs? You do that by celebrating people's attempts. So you celebrate, even if it didn't go so well, you honor and celebrate the effort that they're making on the way to the new future state, as opposed to people doing it perfectly. And it's very hard for organizations to do, but that's how you begin to reward for people's efforts, not necessarily perfection. That helps you overcome switch cost.
So in chapter 3, then you talk about the 3 priorities of change leadership: compassion, communication, and clarity. And I love that alliteration there, the 3 C's. Can you tell us more about why they are the priorities?
Yeah, so let me just turn this and ask you a question. Those make sense, right?
Complete sense. I'm like, well, compassion is about understanding. I know this change is hard. And the communication is say, actually, you know what? I'm sharing good news, or I don't have the news to share, or listen, we don't know it all yet, but we'll get there. So there's something about that communication piece, or at least if I was asked for my opinion, let's call it a spade when it comes to that. And then clarity. Well, what does this mean for me? Or what's the impact? Or have we considered how we're going to get there? Am I going to get the resources? So from a personal perspective, that's how I understand it. Is that the gist of it?
Yes, but this is what I think. This isn't new. I just put them in this. This is not new. This should feel very intuitive and make a lot of sense for you. You are already a change expert. That's where we ground. You have a ton of wisdom that you have gathered, both leading change, but being on the other end of good and probably not so good change leadership. You know this. So my hope is that those things are very intuitive and make sense. And many leaders are already doing pieces of that. So my job was simply to make it ground that these are the actions from which anything that you do, really, good change leadership is just good leadership. Those three are just a good leadership operating model for anybody. If you don't have one, that's a great right to use those when leading people. But that's the point. They make sense to you. And that's because you're already doing it. So part of it is people understanding. So I ground what I do in neuroscience, try to very simply, and then out of that comes these three priorities, which says in order to overcome some of what our brains do, here are some ways that you do that. And a lot of it is just as you said, by being able to engage that human, treat them as with dignity. And if you're having a reaction, I'm going to trust that from your perspective, it makes sense. So it's simply taking a moment, but you can see you have to switch from the analytic to the empathetic network. So there's multiple processes to then be able to engage using these three priorities. Yes.
And when I was reading this, I'm a coach as well with the ICF. So
Yeah,
go team ICF. And what I noticed, it was heavily influenced by coaching. So you have that disposition of curiosity that my colleague Luke Monaghan talks about. And it's that sense of curiosity that you're trying to get from people to say, when people are resisting, what's going beyond that? Or for yourself, if you're struggling, then you talk about this wisdom 2.0, those perspectives, which sometimes, and this is what I got from the book, is that we have limiting beliefs when it comes to change. Well, I didn't agree to this, so why should I go through? And it's about changing your own perspective, your own limiting beliefs about the change. And I think that's really helpful to people. And you discuss this in the book about reframing. So a big part of reframing is changing our perspective to say, listen, well, what am I struggling with, isn't it? First, before I bring it to the team. And then if the team are struggling, how do I help them navigate that? Or how can I be curious about how they might perceive this change?
And that's it. That goes back to that magic bullet we were talking about. And by the way, this is in all life. When you understand that nobody controls your intellectual, emotional freedom, nobody. So your ability to handle anything in life, right, that comes along is your perspective. You can either choose to be the victim or the benefactor in any circumstance. And it's not saying that they're not difficulties. God knows I've been when I was at Lehman Brothers, I didn't want that change, right? And I only knew part of it. But at the same time, I reframed that, and so did a number of my colleagues, that, well, I guess we're needed elsewhere, right? That's a different perspective than feeling, oh my gosh, which is what happens with a lot of changes that are not in our control. We end up acting like there's something bad or wrong with us, that this change is being done to us. Well, as long as we work in organizations, we can decide how much energy am I going to give my struggle with this. So it doesn't mean you have to like it. It doesn't mean ignoring challenges. It's not about that. It's simply saying, if I go into fear and anxiety, and anger is just another form of fear, right? If I go into that, my energy is now being wasted. So how do I honor the fact that I don't like this? Somebody should have asked me. Yes, maybe they should have, but we know in organizations, right, and life in general, that doesn't really happen. So this is okay. Now let me start with myself. If I'm having a problem with it, let me honor that. Is there wisdom there? We talked about, and then I go into I think there's eight reasons why many of us resist change. It happens every single training or workshop I do, the same ones come up. So as I like to say, welcome human, you're in very good company. But then if you can shift your perspective to understand, right, as long as we're in organizations and our name isn't on the awning or the sign, even when that happens, we have to deal with things we don't want. But then we decide, okay, this change is happening. So, right, how do I want to go through this? I can keep resisting it. Okay. And is that going to get me more or less of what I want? But that is the key, that you can start with yourself. And again, reframing and shifting your perspective when you do that and you pay attention to your own feelings, you're doing a couple things. One is you're probably going to not be surprised, because if you're feeling unhappy about it, your team will too. So you're going to be able to better handle their feelings, and you're also honoring yourself. There probably is wisdom there, but how do you shift that in a way that helps you move forward and doesn't keep you holding on in anger or frustration? That is the wasted energy. Now, I do talk about in the book, there may be a change you cannot get on board with. And if that's the case, then you need to leave, right? If the organization is going in that direction, and this is how I also say to leaders, if there's a change and your team member cannot get on board with it, I say resistance is normal. It's not a permanent state, right? So if somebody doesn't want to make that change, you can absolutely treat them with dignity. You can understand that, and then let them know that then they probably need to find a different role, or leave the organization. And that's okay if this is the best thing for them. There's no problem here.
There's something you touched on. You talk about anger and frustrations. And in the book, you say all emotions are good emotions. And there are people just listing in here kind of going, oh my God, there's bad emotions. That is complete poppycock. They're just kind of going, that all emotions are good. Tell me more.
Yes. I want you to tell me more, because I'm curious about why that resonated with you. You go first, and then I'll tell you more about that. Why did that resonate with you?
Well, it's funny. It's when I respond to something, because I'm a coach and I do a lot of reflection, and I might journal if I'm really struggling. And I often go and ask myself, what is it that I'm struggling with? What is it I'm trying to defend? What is it I'm trying to protect? And usually it's something that's really important to me, like a value or something like that. So we were talking about that resistance piece before. And underneath the surface, then, what are my different interests or my needs that may not be served as a result? I remember there was a place I was working with, and what it meant for me was I would actually have a return to burnout, and my boundaries weren't being respected. And I actually voted with my feet there. And that was where I drew a line. Or there was another where I walked away from a contract where I thought it was unethical. Oh, this was like 6 weeks before I was getting married, and I needed the cash. And I knew I was marrying the right woman when she said, we don't need the cash. I don't want you losing sleep over this, and I don't want you to break integrity for me. And there's elements like that where, I'm voting out, but there's another time where you're actually in the situation because of financial, security or whatever that you need. And it's like, okay, how do I adapt to this? How do I change my perspective? Now, us talking about it is very different than actually experiencing it in the moment. And especially if the recession on a bit, when you're in Lehman Brothers, like you sound like blasé about it now, but like you're walking out of a cardboard box with your personal possessions and you're getting escorted out by security. I'm sure that's what I saw on the TV, but it's easier said than done, going through the emotions, and especially as some people label them bad emotions.
Yeah. So I think when I say good and bad, technically emotions, like anything, are data. They just come in a different form. So when I say there's no bad emotion, I'm certainly not saying that every emotion is comfortable. The anger, the frustration, all of that stuff is very hard when you're actually feeling it, for sure. But the point is, one, are you even aware? So I loved what you said. There was a sense of, I'm not liking this. Let me take a minute to understand, what is it about this that's not going to work for me, that I'm struggling with? And then from there, you then can make a decision. Oftentimes, people confuse taking a pause and reflecting with taking an action. In other words, there's a practice that I engage in, which is called no bad thought. Even things that could seem like crazy. Most of us have an very overactive ego that when we think a thought, oh, I don't like this person, and maybe you're thinking of different things that might happen to that person who's driving you nuts, right? That's no bad thought, right? Truly, it's in there, and it's giving yourself space and room to understand, I'm trusting myself. What is it that's not okay? Because once you do that, then you can understand, oh, you know what? This is reminding me of a time in the past when this happened and that didn't end well for me. Okay, let me take a deep breath. Do I have enough information now to say that's exactly what's going to happen? No, probably not. Okay, so let me just take care of my past trauma, take a couple deep breaths so I can be present in the moment. There may be a situation where you are being asked to do something that from a value perspective, you can't get on board with. So long as you're clear about that, right? And then you say, I'm not aligned with this, then you maybe have to make that tough decision, which is, I can't honor this. But the fact is that you honored yourself. That is what's most important. But none of this is easy, right? And many humans, right, given all the things that we've been through in these last several years, many people are getting a crash course in my internal state and my perspective and my views create and control my reality. So again, I can use any situation as, and it doesn't, and I might take me a couple of days, even me myself, I teach this stuff. I can have a couple of days where I'm in a terrible space where I'm either in fear or I'm in anger. But I know now, okay, let me just sort through this and let me understand. And then I'm much more able to say that these are normal reactions from some part of me. So if I can understand it first without labeling it, then I can maybe work through it. And then as the leader, you're going to encounter those very same things with other people. So if you can sort of maintain what I like to call your emotional sea legs, because you've had some experience riding out your own, you could potentially be of greater service to someone on your team. And remember, this is where power dynamics come in. People get more afraid and frustrated when changes come down, they're in a hierarchy where people who have more quote unquote power in the organization than you have are dictating something, right? So this is always remembering you've got people who are struggling because they feel like they're not in control. And that's what we talked about. When you're not in control, then what can happen? And our ego tells us, oh my God, if you're not in control, we're going to die. You can dress it up, the ego, however you want. But the ego, unless you have the observing self that says, hang on, let me reframe this, what's going on? You're always operating from ego. And the ego is all about, I'm going to die. That's it. Right. And that's why we keep going into fight or flight. That's why anxiety and fear is so powerful.
And for our listeners, we have to just let you know, this is only chapter 2 and chapter 3 we're talking about, just so as you know. And on page 139, it reminds me of the work of Dr. Robert Keegan and Lahey, the immunity to change. And I was actually coached by Bob Keegan in Harvard, all right? And I have to give you this compliment. You explained that so shortly and sweetly to me, because I really struggled with this concept at the start. So this is where you're on the shoulders of giants, aren't you? So you take somebody else's work, and then you go, well, here's a different way of looking at it, or they've done a bit of work and then we just add to it. And what I like here is the loss, explorations, directions is about really being curious to go, okay, when it comes to change, they're losing something. And for us, it's trying to discover what is it that might be losing. So you've have it here is some people might be losing scope and influence, so or degrees of responsibility, power, and control. They might be losing their expertise as a go-to person, so that's the ego there. Might be losing a sense of accomplishment, like a feeling of pride or purpose at work because it's a shift in direction, or maybe their past work might feel obsolete. Again, you have might be losing the relationship, or those valued relationships, and might be sensing loneliness or isolation, whatever it may be. Routines and structure, so especially if you're in a public service, it's like, oh well, I like this, and this is where they went to this job because of steadiness. Now it's not steady, so they're losing that certainty that you were talking about there. They love to do what that give them energy. So those activities that give them strength and play to their strengths and career progression, they're going to go, oh, hold on here, I don't know where I'm going yet. And then inspiring future vision to say, listen, this is the dream that I had for myself, and I'm not energized by this. And I have to say, you're saving people reading a massive book by just doing that. Because it's really about, like, what is it that I'm resisting? What is it that I'm doing that not doing? That's that inertia piece that we talked about. And And that's what I really liked about this book, because then you give us that structure when you're having this conversation, is frame the discussion with people. Ask one or more of the following questions, and you give a list of questions. And then after listening to the responses, reflect back. And then you give a list of sample prompts and then seek agreement. Now, you make it sound very simple, but what you've done is you've put in a career's worth of work with questions that saves people from doing the work. And this is why we're talking about building on the shoulders of giants. You have taken all the work that I would have seen from, let's say, Marshall Goldsmith, from conflict coaching, from neuroscience, all in one book. Brilliant work. Stellar work, I must say. So speaking about that and changing perspectives, Wisdom 2.0, what is that?
So that was when you were saying, you were talking about your example of the change and you were feeling a lot of resistance to it. It's starting there. They didn't ask me. This is my expertise, or I'm going to be losing something that I really like. So first is understanding that just because you have a feeling that's uncomfortable, don't avoid it. Don't just shove it to the side. This is where, let me understand this. What is going on with me? Then it's a reframe. So for instance, Wisdom 2.0 is one of the things I have there is, well, we tried this change before in the past and it failed. And now they're, doing it again. And the Wisdom 2.0 is, well, of course you don't want to, that your wisdom's coming up. Your resistance is warning you that this didn't work. Well, that makes perfect sense. But then it's okay. In the present moment, how do I reframe that? Could the reframe be, has something changed internally or externally where it could be a better idea? Are the people who are sponsoring or leading this change, do they even know what happened in the past? So at that point, then it's, how do I reframe that so I can be of service as a leader in the organization? And so much of this is when we understand and are able to reframe that this could be important data for them if they don't know. And if they do know, then I need to understand from the people who are leading the change, what has changed that actually makes this a good idea now and more likely to succeed now than in the past. And it's simply getting us over that hump of that difficult emotion so that we can then have a productive, hopefully, conversation. Now, this never guarantees. We can never control how somebody will react to when we have a question or we want to bring something forward. But you will certainly have a better chance of getting through if you present that in a way that is, hey, you may or may not be aware of this, change leader, change sponsor. We did this in the past. Are you aware? Oh, yes, we are. Okay, great. Help me understand from your perspective, what's different now that you think can help us succeed in the past when we failed, right? And so that's a reasonable question, right? That's reasonable. So a lot of this is the intensity with which people feel emotion causes many people simply to want to avoid. And what I'm saying, there's gold there. So to your point, what I've tried to do to make it as easy as possible for people, and this is where I think the neuroscience plus my ability to titrate out and translate emotion into action is what I've offered step by step. So you have this feeling. Here are some ways you can understand it that would be helpful for you to help you, as me and my friends say, talk us off the ledge, right? And that's normal, not criticizing myself. Okay, and then when it's the right time, how do I want to use this going forward? So to your point, one way could be, I'm frustrated with my employee who's resisting. Well, let me take that loss analysis tool and do this with them. Maybe they're not aware of why they're reacting. So how do I take them through to help them understand it so we can move through? How do I use that myself and then reframe it 2.0 to say, how do I use this in service of myself and my team and the organization versus I use this as a block to be more frustrated, which is really not helpful for anybody. And then to your point, I try to give the leader both cues that say, you may be experiencing this type of thing. So if you're experiencing, one of the things I talk about at the beginning of the 3 priorities is, if you're saying the same thing as a leader over and over again, right? And you're still not seeing the results that tell you, stop telling. This is when you can ask. So I do that from that perspective, as well as say, you may specifically get this tough question, and let me give you sample responses. Because most people, when we're in that fight or flight mode, we're in emotion, we have a very hard time then in that point saying things. So to your point, I try to make it easy for people. Here, let me get you started. This can help you when you are, because that's really what blocks, right? When we are in that high emotions, either in reaction to somebody as we're the leader, they're resisting change, or ourselves are frustrated because of a change. Our goal is in that moment, we just need some time to organize our thoughts so we're not just reacting. And hopefully this book will help people in those moments move out of the fight or flight and start to move through action. Potentially that could be very helpful.
And this is where, whether I'm doing change management workshops or teaching change, or when I'm doing conflict within teams, it's really tapping into coaching, that coaching style again. And often when I talk about change management, then I often say, listen, when you're dealing with active resistance or passive resistance, at least you have something to work with.
Exactly right.
If people are in apathy, well, that's completely different, and there's not much you can do there. But at least you have something to engage people in some way, with that disposition of curiosity, or take a pause, or try to discover what's going on for them, and find ways then around that. At least you can work with that.
Yes, you have to be able to tolerate that moment.
Exactly.
And that's a lot of what you're teaching is, when we are in conflict, our ego may feel threatened. When we're in that conversation, as a leader, you're encountering resistance, your ego is going to get triggered and feel threatened. And we don't understand this, but we go into fight or flight, right? This is why when the ego is in control in that moment, and then we're in the analytic network, if I'm not getting the response I want from you, my ego is taking that as a threat. So my ability in that moment to be like, oh, that's interesting, I'm finding myself reacting. And in that moment, not to fire back, but in that moment to have enough space where I'm like, oh gosh, this is Elizabeth's internal voice. I realize I'm uncomfortable. I'm going to tolerate. You have to be able to tolerate discomfort. So success isn't feeling great and happy and comfortable. That's not success. Success is in the midst of the discomfort. I'm taking a couple deep breaths, and in that moment, I can actually engage you and not take your difference of opinion or perspective as a threat. But I'm like, And sometimes I say to people, maybe that's all you can do is simply say, and say, hey, William, as I understand it, this change is problematic for you. Is that correct? Right? Because my insides are freaking out and I don't know exactly what to say or ask, but at the moment I can simply invite you to share a little bit more about what's going on. And that creates A, more time for me and more space. B, I'm really understanding where you're coming from, because maybe what you're saying you're resisting isn't actually the issue. So if I can get some more information, that's actually going to help both of us. And also, you're going to feel like I care, right? I'm inviting you. I trust you. You're having a reaction. I'm sure it makes sense from your perspective. I just don't understand it. So I need you to help me understand what's going on.
So that's where what leads me to next, and hopefully you have time for this, is the turnaround conversation. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to briefly refer to the playbook, which is in chapter 5, and how to communicate that change, and then we'll go into the turnaround question next. So we don't have time for this today, but in chapter 5, you cover in the leadership playbook is understand the impact of change, identify strengths, which I'd love to touch on it if that's okay, prepare for tough questions and reactions, vision success, that's where you prime people. So we might actually talk about that too. Sorry. Create change, have a team conversation, follow up, and you have all the resources here between chapter 5, 6, and 7. So listen, people, please, this is such a good book. So let's go back to that turnaround conversation. So, for example, I'm having a one-to-one, and what you have here is you have sample conversation starters. I'll read that out, but can you talk us through a turnaround conversation? So, a turnaround conversation, we have one person that's kind of struggling.
Yes.
What does that conversation look like, or what might you say, or what's the structure to it?
Yes, exactly. And so that gives an example of when we're in a difficult conversation. So it's a difficult conversation. The person may or may not be open to it. They may or may not be aware of how they're coming across. And so the turnaround conversation is really components of any good conversation. First of all, I'm treating you with dignity. I'm simply saying to you, hey, right, I'd love to talk to you about whatever it is, right? I'm not sensing you're on board with this change. Right. And I sort of kick it off. I'd love to talk to you about that and make sure the person is on board with you. The next piece is where most people get, quote unquote, giving feedback or having a difficult conversation. This is where most people get it wrong. So most people spend time using words that describe people, not behaviors. So you're not communicating well, you're not collaborating well, William, as a result of this change. Okay, that's not very helpful. So what I tell people is when you're having a difficult conversation, you want to be clear, but you're also trying to reduce as much defensiveness as you can. You can't control it, but you can reduce it. How do you do that? You describe behavior. You describe behavior as a video camera would, and that's the key for these turnaround conversations. You're not assigning intent. You're simply saying, here's what I want to talk to you about. Here's the behavior that I'm noticing. And this behaviors, for instance, you keep engaging in these behaviors, that's the old state, not these behaviors, it's the future state. So as a result of that, I'm assuming you're not on board with the change. Now, you want to use behavior because the person might be like, well, what are you talking about? I'm completely on board with the change. So they're on board with the change, which is great to know. Then you want to talk them through, well, what behavior change do you think needs to happen? What are you doing that you think makes you on board with the change, right? So you're just trying to clarify. You could also get somebody who says, yeah, no, I'm not on board with the change. Okay, great. And then you get curious about what it is. But the turnaround conversation is try to be very clear with somebody. Here's my understanding of you're not on board. Here's why. Here's the behaviors that are telling me that. So now you and I are both clear about why. And then we decide, how do we want to move forward differently? Do you want to move forward differently? And the turnaround conversation breaks these out so that you are more likely to have a conversation where people are more clear at the end of it about what's expected. But as a leader, you have to tolerate that discomfort as you're having the conversation and the emotions that come up.
So I'm going to read from the book here. Use the sample conversation starters and questions below to help you have the turnaround conversation. So you have the frame, discover, recognize, and focus. So is it okay if I read it out?
Please, yes.
I'd like to talk to you about that. I want to make sure we're both clear on the outcomes we're looking for and how we can deliver on them, including how I can help. So that's building in that trust. That's the frame. Discover. I want to share some observations with you, but first, I'd like to get your perspective on what's going on related to that. What do you think is happening? What do you think has been preventing you from being at your best? Brilliant question. Recognize. Here's what I've seen and heard. Here is the impact it's having. Here's what I see you needing to shift or change. Focus on one thing at most, you say there. So great advice there. And are you concerned about anything I'm asking you to shift? So brilliant discovery questions. And then finally, focus. What do you think you can do differently? What might get in your way? What strengths can you leverage to help you? Here's what I've seen you do that can help. So again, that reinforcement and encouragement. What's the best result we could achieve? What's the first step you could take when you start? What action can I take to help you? Now, they are all things that are signaling I am going to be supportive of you, whatever. And it's that psychological safety, that how those questions are framed. Basically, there is no noise. It is judgment free. It is very, as I call, clean questions. And often when I teach about conflict, I teach about non-violent communication. And that's exactly what I'm seeing here is people can really, you're getting straight to the point where it's without emotion. And that's why I had to read out all those questions. It was really good because especially that one, what action can I take to help you? How can you not be on board with that?
Well, exactly. And so, is so much of the ability for leaders to have this conversation does rest on trust. So if you are in a situation where there's a lack of trust, either with you in the organization or with you and your team, and again, no judgment of why, there's a lot of that happens. And I think a lot of the loss of trust happens inadvertently. People are overwhelmed. The organization or leaders are just trying to do what they think they have to do to get the job done. And then the behaviors they engage in, whether it's known or unknown, hurt trust. So part of that is understanding that the more trust you have, the more helpful these conversations will be. But no matter what, simply the ability when you are encountering any type of resistance, to be able to take a moment and simply say to yourself, I'm frustrated that this team member is still not getting on board with this change. I thought I've been clear. I don't get it. That you're not ignoring that. And so it's about, okay, well done me. I've taken a lot of action. And so the first conversations that you might have with somebody are initially, let me find out what's going on. So this really helps. If you get to the point where you feel like I have had this conversation, then it becomes what I call a conversation about the conversation. So then I would say, hey, William, I'm still not seeing you make these behavior changes that tell me you're on board with the change. So I believe we've talked about this. Are you seeing that the same way I am? Right? And so if the person continues to behave in a way that tells you that they're still not on board, you want to address that, because then it becomes, we've talked about it. Is there anything else? And again, you can go through the loss analysis tool. You can go in the past of what you talked about. But bottom line, as I say, resistance is normal, but it's not a permanent state. And this is where, again, leaders struggle. And then I have a whole conversation that was in the book about somebody who could not get on board with the change, who ended up finding a job elsewhere, which was great. But I've been in other situations where you can treat the person with dignity. That's okay if you can't get on board with this change. I get it. If that's what's best for you, that's fine. But then you cannot stay in this role. Is creating clarity about that, but not being obnoxious about it, right? And this is where, when we focus both on behaviors and we're not assigning intent, you're just being difficult, you're blah, blah. No. Here's the behavior. It takes a lot of that charge out of it, and it creates greater clarity. Focus on the behavior. It takes more discipline as the leader to translate somebody's quote unquote, your emotion into what behaviors are you seeing or not seeing. That takes discipline.
Yeah, and I've had situations where you talk about discipline and struggle and the role of leadership when it comes to change management. And I've heard the situation from a client where they were going through a conversation about change with their manager. The manager could not make eye contact with them at all, was very insecure in their body language. So physically, their presence was showing a lack of confidence, not making eye contact, and then asked a high performer, I might add, to drop their standards.
Oh, yeah.
And that person was just kind of going, this is not for me. This organization is not for me, and you're not for me, and voted with their feet and gone.
It's a painful moment, but an important one.
That's the importance of yourself then, of changing your perspective and being ready and primed for that. So this is the segue I'm going into. The next one is identifying strengths. So that's something I hadn't considered before. So tell our listeners about that. Why should I identify strengths in my team as part of a change management process?
Yeah, so I go into the book how at ADP we acquired the Marcus Buckingham Company, which was, again, another pivotal moment for me in understanding that. So I'd say that plus the neuroscience really helped me understand the importance of this. Bottom line is, You're moving people from anxiety when you're focusing on strengths to basically a place where you feel more optimistic and hopeful. So we also talked about the neuroscience of optimism, which we'll get into later. Our brains give at least 3 times more psychological weight to the negative than the positive. That's what Rick Hansen talked about. When we have a brain, and if we're not aware of this, we start to confuse habit, which is focusing on the negative and feeling anxious and uncomfortable, as normal. It's not normal. It's not even reality. When your brain is really focusing you on the negative, there's plenty of beautiful, wonderful, positive things happening at the same time. You're not focused on it. This is why it is really important to scan for the good. That is the antidote to so much anxiety, right? Because the ego never goes back and is like, oh, sorry, I was wrong about that one. Sorry about that. Now, oh, yes, this is going to be great. It's always of, oh my gosh, what's the next disaster that's going to happen? So when you focus on strengths, you're really putting somebody back in that position of power, internal power, celebrating what works, recognizing what they have to offer. It's putting them back in a state of love, really. That's really what it is. Anything that puts us back into joy and love. Now, what I noticed, this was fascinating. I used to do that internal eye roll when people used to be like, oh, focus on strengths. I'd be like, oh my God, seriously, like that sounded really fluffy to me. But then, I'm very psychological, but I got a real strong practical streak, right? So I'll get on board with this if I can like make it really make sense, which is what the neuroscience did for me. Once I saw like, oh my gosh, the brain sets us up. Okay, now I can really use the strengths. But I had to develop the strengths muscle. And what I find is most other people have to do that too, because the ego will be like, oh, that's just fluff. Oh, that doesn't matter. No, it does matter. This is the ego's habit. So you have to start to quiet that voice and develop that strength. And what that does is when you realize your value, even if there's a change that's happening, what is it that you love to do? Are you still going to be able to do some of those things? It's just, it looks different. Or truly, are we asking you to do things that are going to drain you? If that's the case, then it's probably not going to be the right role or job for you. And that may be a different conversation. But before we go there, because the ego is really all going to look about how this change is going to be bad, right? The ego is focusing a lot more weight on that. You're as a leader simply trying to counterbalance that and helping remind people of all the brilliance that exists inside them, of how they matter to you on the team, of their contribution. So I talk about a story. I had somebody in the team who was afraid she was going to lose her job. We were going through a lot of changes, and I take people through that sort of coaching conversation that really helps with that. But after the initial fear, then I talked about, what is it that makes you happy? What do you love about your job? Here's what I see you do really good at. She was so wonderful at collaborating and always offering to help the team. It genuinely made a difference. So having her know that I see that and value that made her feel good, right? It helped her feel powerful again. And that's the point in these conversations. When we put people in their strengths, that changes everything. That changes the neurochemistry in the brain. It really helps a brain that is stuck in fear and anxiety. It shifts out of that. That's the power of strengths.
That's where you start priming the brain then for possibility thinking, because I'm assuming it's hard when there's a threat of change coming, or you know what the impact is going to be. Or for example, and I get this all the time, is I'll have a couple of people, especially if I'm working with an organization that's say a science-based organization, pharma or high tech, is you're going to have people where the analytical network is primarily dominant, and they're like kind of going, oh my God, are you going to talk about strengths now? So that's where that priming piece for possibility thinking. So if I was working with someone like that in my team, then how might I engage them in that priming, or how can we engage in that possibility thinking? Because that's about envisioning success then, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah. So I'm going to answer your question in 2 ways. This is the power of neuroscience. I was delivering a session to PhD scientists that were working at a research organization in Washington. There was about 250 of them, right? The neuroscience helps them understand the emotions in a way that they then it validates the power of that to them. So this is why anybody, when you understand this, if you're trying to convince your leadership about emotions are important, I'm hoping these tools can help people frame that in a way that makes it easier for an organization to understand. People love that. All right, that's one. Two is the optimism piece. What we now know is that again, this makes sense. To have an invention or something new, somebody has to envision the possibility. What we didn't know until recently, though, is the power of that. When you start to envision and you go into possibility thinking, your brain takes a can do. Oh, I'm going to start working on this, versus when fear comes up, our brain takes a defensive stance and is about fear and protective. So when you can switch into that, what we now know is that optimism is not only the feeling that we get when something goes well, it's that when we can prime the brain, and this is why I go through an envisioning exercise, even if it's tough now, if you've got a number of people who are focused on the same possible outcome that is good, that outcome is much more likely to happen. They've done multiple studies now where they have people envisioning an outcome, and the outcome happens, right? They're all over the globe. They're given a target, and that happens. Well, that just makes sense. So call it quantum field, call it mirror neurons, call it whatever you want. But when you've got the same people and the possibility is shared, positive vision, and it's in that quantum field, it now exists, right? It's that North Star that we can direct. So again, that moves the brain out of fear. It gives people something to hold on to. And then bonus prize, you help connect your folks to that vision in the future state. What are they experiencing? What's something new that has come to them as a result of this? Right? How could this it's hard, we can't control the how right now. We don't know how it's going to happen, but we can certainly focus our vision on what we would love to achieve for ourselves, for our organization, for our clients or customers. So that helps people shift them into possibility and starts to potentially get a little bit of excitement. So that's the power of visioning a positive future state.
So for our Irish listeners, I'm going to give you a practical example where this has taken place in Irish business. So I used to be a program manager for a development program for this organization called Musgrave, and they own the Super Value Brands, which is one of the 4 or 5 major retailers for groceries in Ireland. And they had a visioning exercise. And part of that, somebody came up with we want to develop our own coffee brand and coffee beans. And now it has become the biggest coffee brand in Ireland, called Frank and Honest. And that is a true story. It started a kernel of a visioning exercise put into reality, and a massive success for that organization.
That's it. And along the way, people are like, oh my gosh, Starbucks, how could we blah, right? And it's not that you're ignoring those things. You're just deciding we are all going to focus our collective, very powerful energy on a possibility. It doesn't mean we won't shift. It doesn't mean there won't be challenges along the way, but we're holding this. And when you hold it together with a group of people, it is very powerful.
So I wanted to go through a little piece here, right? Just before we finish up. We talked about identifying the strengths in the team there, but then you talk about resilience. And what I love about it on page 147, you quote the work of Charney and Southwick on 10 research-based strategies for building workplace resilience. Is it okay if I read these out? So 1 is keeping a positive attitude. 2 is reframing stressful thoughts. 3, developing a moral compass. 4, finding a resilient role model. 5, facing fears. 6, developing active coping skills. 7, establishing and nurturing supportive social network. 8, prioritizing physical well-being. 9, training the brain. And finally, 10, playing to your strengths. I have to say, you have done such stellar work providing a pragmatic and also empathetic resource to people. So what I have to say, the piece at the end where you're providing those team structures, I'd say will be invaluable to people listening in. I'm just going to give you a space now. Is there anything you think we missed during the podcast that you'd like to add?
I think no, I think you've covered it. My hope is that it just helps humanity in general, and people can understand, again, life changing when you realize your brain sets you up for a negative outlook, that only you can choose what you're going to focus on, and that your power as a leader is absolutely acknowledging challenges, but constantly remembering that we have been through a number of changes, all of us, and we are better and stronger together. And also when we have something that could be hopeful, whether it happens or not, we don't know at this point, but it's certainly more likely to happen if you and your team are engaged together, that there is trust and that you're seeing something hopeful. But again, right, that's up to us to control. So I'm hoping that is helpful to all.
It has been so helpful. And that's what we do on this podcast, is encourage people to take a different path, which is yourself, your team, and your organization. Dr. Elizabeth Moran, it has been such a pleasure, a genuine pleasure, not only reading your book, but having this quality time with you. And I'm sure our listeners have enjoyed that too. If people were to find out more about you and your book and what you do, how might they do so?
So you can go to elizabethmorantransformation.com. So that is my website. That talks about, I think, some of I do leadership development sessions where I come into organizations, and that could be 90 minutes, 4 hours, or a full day. Also on LinkedIn, people are welcome to connect with me on LinkedIn. I'd love to continue the conversation if someone wants to do that. I think you have that. People can certainly feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn, and yeah, would love that. Love to connect more with your audience.
Thank you so much for joining the Workplace Podcast.
Thank you, William. It's been such a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to the Workplace Podcast with your host, William Corless. Our special thanks to this episode's guest for sharing their expertise with us. If you enjoyed this episode, please download and share it. For updates on future episodes and to get in contact with us about any workplace topics, please follow Yellowwood on LinkedIn and Twitter at Different Paths. As always, you can head over to yellowwood.ie for any other information. Yellowwood, your external learning and development partner, provider of executive coaching, facilitation and training. Take a different path to success with your career, leadership, team and organization.